One thing I learned this year at TPRC on the Hill, in part thanks to my work, I was told that the telephone network was completely deregulated in the 1980s. I bet you didn't know that. I didn't know that. I had this vague recollection of the 96 Act.
Right, which is why we just spent,
Yeah.
the 90s at near roots.
It must be my age. But he worked for Wheeler, so it's all good. Okay, I think we all know, and I'm looking around this room, these are experienced people, that we need more spectrum to serve a rapidly growing demand for mobile and even fixed wireless services. What's most interesting about the problem is that you can't go to Walmart and buy it off the shelf. It's pretty much all been allocated and assigned to somebody. So you're going to have to take it from one party to give it to another. And this obviously creates some tensions. Okay? People don't like to give away valuable assets. They don't like it taken away. Sometimes they don't want to sell it. And sometimes they just don't want to fool with it. Okay? Because why? I have it. It's only going up in value, call it in 10 years. What we're beginning to see, in some cases, is the use of financial incentives to try to get people to move. We did that probably most explicitly with the television, reverse auction in television. But there are also possibilities, and we've done this many times in the past, the FCC has done this many times in the past, is a sort of eminent domain where you relocate people, sometimes voluntarily and sometimes they require people to move in order to clear a band or repack a band so that a new, more valuable service can be provided. There are interesting cases. Rights can be poorly defined. These things can create windfalls for people, and there's always resistance to that. Do we sell these things in auctions? Do we do some other mechanism for assigning the right? Okay, is there interference problems? Okay, we've seen some of that hold up some spectrum problems. We've seen interference problems be resolved quite easily in some cases. Okay, so all these problems exist in various different bands. Each is unique, and we need to understand what's the nature of the problem and to start looking for solutions, because in my research, and we've written some about this, there's not a lot of deep analysis on how you resolve these, solve these problems, some of these problems that exist. We've written a few things on it, and we continue to write on it. But we have a great panel here today to talk about these issues, people who know far more about this than I do. In fact, they've probably individually forgotten more than I'll ever know about spectrum. We've got down there Peter Tenhula from NTIA. He's the acting associate administrator for janitorial services. Spectrum management. Okay, so he knows a little bit about this. It's been a very long time doing spectrum work. Next to me, on my right, is Morgan O'Brien. He's the CEO presently of PDVWireless, but you may recognize the name from a small telephone company called Nextel. Built the first digital network, and the push-to-talk phone, which the elimination of has got to be the greatest social harm in the history of mankind. To my left is Julian McHenry. She was when I first met her, at NTIA as their chief economist, doing spectrum work there. She has another role at the FCC, but her claim to fame, I think, is going to be the first chief of the Office of Economics and Analytics. Okay, that's a nice job, and I hope that shop does well. Of course, I was in a shop like that once. It doesn't exist anymore. The bureaus really don't like it when you drop in and say, "You're doing this all wrong," as we learned slowly. Hank Hultquist, he's the vice president of Federate over at AT&T, and Spectrum is on his porch, so he knows a lot about this stuff too. And Hank and I worked together since the old days at NTIA, and I always have a lot of respect for what Hank has to say, and I bug him all the time to get the dirty details on things. Come off the ivory tower for a few minutes to get down in the weeds with Hank. I wanted to start with Julia, who's at the FCC, been focused on spectrum for probably a few years now at NTIA and the FCC, to kind of give us a background about what are the bands that are presently being considered for repurposing, and briefly, if you want to, what some of the hurdles are to those specific cases.
George, thank you for having me here. I really appreciate it. Probably not going to say too much that people don't already know, but I'll start with the FCC. So we are looking in the next year to be auctioning 37, 39, and 42. So we have those, in the hopper already, and we have some fairly interesting new reverse auction ideas in there. The big one that we're focused on now is C-band, where we're exploring all sorts of options. I think, when I was at NTIA, we were also looking at this, and so on the C-band, we'll really look at 3.7 and 4.2, and of course at NTIA, they were starting to explore what's just below the CBRS band, whether there's anything feasible there. I think we were also through an effort at NTIA of looking across the board for what are some innovative ways we could start thinking about repurposing additional spectrum, even as it remains in federal hands. How much can we get out to do some interesting things with it? So that's a little bit of an overview, probably less than you wanted, but I think we maybe want to dig into the details as we go through the group.
You're about to have this auction, and that's the one we have shared access, and that's what they're the PAL licenses. How long that process has been going on to get to the auction? When did that start?
So it was before my time
Okay.
there, right? So I was actually at Brattle when
So
the
it's got to be,
proceedings started.
22 years ago?
It's been a long process. I think there was a little bit of a hiccup as we looked back at it when Chairman Pai came in. There was also, I think we went back to the drawing board a little bit to see what could happen, sort of how much more we could do with dynamic access and with the radar systems there. So there was, we took a little bit back on that front, but we're getting there. But certainly, that I think highlights, frankly, quite well the struggle with auctioning, which it's a long process to coordinate with all the users, with all the incumbents, to make sure we have a solution that will work for them, to make sure it's a solution that the industry can work with, and then get it auctioned. Is it an extraordinary process?
Yes, it is. Hank, we spoke the other day, and I know you have some interest in this C-band spectrum, which, by the way, is at least part of the spectrum used to send signals to the 8-foot old satellite dishes out in people's yards, right? And rural Alabama, among other places. And also to transmit signals to the cable head-end, so the cable industry has had a few things to say about that. But what is special about this band, do you think, for the wireless industry, the C-band?
Thanks, George, for the question. Thanks for inviting me. As George said, he and I worked together many years ago, and I feel like that sort of gives me license to maybe say some things I ordinarily wouldn't, so don't necessarily think everything I say is what AT&T thinks. I may just say some crazy stuff that comes to my mind.
Gave me 3 mimosas before you got there, too.
Look, I think if you think about 5G and the road to having really strong, ubiquitous 5G networks, mid-band spectrum is going to play a huge role in that. The FCC's done a great job in terms of lining up millimeter wave spectrum, but that's not going to be a basis for broad, ubiquitous coverage. This is where the mid-band comes in, and there are only a couple of bands that I would say today are not, are underutilized, or as the title of this panel would have it, they're not they could move from low lower value uses to higher value uses. And C-band obviously is one of those. I think to their credit, the satellite operators recognized that there was an opportunity for more valuable use of a portion of that spectrum. It's a complicated problem because you don't have an exclusive licensee here. This is spectrum that's shared among a number of firms, and so they came up with an innovative proposal that they would create a consortium, and that they would then figure out how much could be sold, how the current uses could be relocated, how the costs of that could be covered, and turn this into a win-win for everybody. I think that's what we hope for. I think that's the process the FCC has undertaken, and we've already been participating, and we look forward to continue to participate.
How much spectrum are we talking about?
So at this point, the consortium has indicated that they believe that at least 200 megahertz of the 500 could be diverted from satellite use and put to flexible use. And so I would say it's at least 200, and hopefully, or possibly I should say, when the process gets further down the line and more is known about what the value of the spectrum would be and what the costs of moving the current uses are, it could be that it'll be more than 200 megahertz. Wow.
Well, let's jump to the other extreme of that and get Morgan to explain to us and teach us what his company is up to, which is a little different than that, and it's also kind of a soup to nuts proposal. That somebody didn't call him up one day and say, hey, we're going to auction off this spectrum. The whole program has been designed by PDV and some of their partners in the 9 megahertz band, which we all should know is pretty good spectrum, very valuable spectrum. But this is a very unique case. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what you're up to, Morgan?
Thank you, and good morning. I've operated for many, many years in this space with the premise that at the end of the day, the FCC is driven to push spectrum to its highest and best use. And there's really nothing, I think that in the history of spectrum management, at least in my now approaching, unfortunately, 50 years, nothing more safe and sure that that's the FCC's instinct and impulse. Some of the other veterans of Nextel and myself a couple of years ago saw that 900 megahertz, which was a space that we were very familiar with, was pretty much trapped in rules that were first crafted in the mid-80s, 1980s, and hadn't been changed really since. So we saw an opportunity to acquire a large position in the 900 megahertz band. And again, just to give you the order of comparison, the total 900 megahertz band that we're discussing here is only 10 megs, 5 megahertz paired. So it's a whole different environment than some of these mid and high band discussions that are going on now. Yet it's super valuable spectrum because of its coverage and penetration characteristics. So we found a unique opportunity where Sprint was no longer using the 900 megahertz spectrum, which it owned, at the largest by far spectrum position at 900, through a series of auctions. This 900 megahertz spectrum, half of it anyway, had been auctioned off over the years, and Nextel, which then became Sprint, had purchased it. So we went into the marketplace and said, here's a small but very valuable below 1 gigahertz piece of spectrum, which we believe, if acquired, could work through the regulatory process at the FCC, which we know is never rapid. And the FCC, at the end of the day, will be motivated to push that spectrum to a higher and better use and to encourage innovation in that spectrum and change the rules suitable for that. Of course, as in many times in the past, the proponent of change, which would be us if we acquire the spectrum and go to the FCC, the proponent of change bears the burden of saying how to dispose of the rights of the incumbents and how to make sure that the incumbents, if they are rebanded, are given comparable facilities. So the net of this process is that we raised $300 million. I believe that anybody would say that the combination was necessary to be able to raise that kind of money 4 years ago. The combination of a heightened interest in good quality spectrum, and also the track record that we had doing something similar at Nextel. And so $300 million was raised. We acquired the spectrum from Sprint. We immediately went to the FCC with a proposal for repurposing the band to allow a portion of the band to be suitable for broadband and most particularly LTE. It would take me way longer than anybody wants to give me to explain the ins and outs of this proceeding, but let me just say sort of the net of it. The net of it is we're optimistic based on things that the chairman has said publicly, that the next stage in our proceeding is imminent, and the next stage would be a notice of proposed rulemaking, hopefully shaped somewhat along the lines of what we had proposed through a series of comments. But the most interesting thing about it, and then I'll stop, the most interesting thing about it is that as we've moved through this process, we have determined that the spectrum is really secondary to the public interest of making this particular spectrum available to be a broadband solution for grid modernization and putting private controlled spectrum in the hands of the electric industry to secure the grid, make the grid more resilient, and take all the benefits of broadband and make them available to the electric industry. So what I say to our team is, it used to be enough to be a wireless company, but in 2018 going into 2019, you really have to be a nascent new player in the electric utility industry to really be able to find an optimum way of using a small but choice piece of broadband spectrum. And here's the most important point, and being able to raise the large amounts of capital to deploy LTE infrastructure. And that brings you to the electric utility industry's dependence on ratepayers, all of us. As ratepayers, all of us who use electricity, helping to contribute to the cost of putting this new technology, weaving it into the fiber of the next the grid modernization. So let me stop there and say, people ask me why I'm still doing this, and my answer is there really isn't anything more rewarding than working through a process like this. Yes, it's frustrating, but consistently for me throughout my career, I found that at the end of the day, the FCC does the right thing, does the smart thing, pushes the boundaries, and I've always relied on that, and hopefully this time I'm not going to be disappointed, but the operation of getting to understand the total environment of the existing users, understanding them, bringing them into some form of support to be able to engineer the move of spectrum from one position to another, just nothing like it to me.
We got Hank over here, he's hogging almost 100 megahertz of spectrum. How much spectrum do you need to build a network? You got 2 paired 5 blocks.
We're 2 LTE channels is 6 megs, and that's plenty to form the backbone opinion, becomes a private LTE, utility-centric opportunity on which then, because that takes care of the broad coverage requirements, because all these utilities have huge coverage requirements. And you want to be in that spectrum is ideal for that purpose. But then when you get to capacity issues, and again, I could speak for hours on the use cases that the electric utility industry has for broadband. In certain areas, there will be capacity constraints sooner rather than later, but there we become interested in the 3.5 and other types of spectrum to put into to build onto our network for capacity. So of course, 6 megahertz in today's world is not enough for any kind of play that isn't very specialized, such as one we could say.
All right. Okay, Peter, why don't you just give a brief statement about what your office does in regards to this topic, and then from that, I think you can talk a little bit about the difficulty of finding, securing and getting spectrum moved through the process to where the FCC make an auction.
Yeah, my brief statement is it's very, very hard. And that's what we do, hard things.
That's why I get Peter just gets straight to the point, doesn't take up a lot of time.
Brief, I'm all for brief. The Office of Spectrum Management, OSM, or also pronounced awesome, is in charge of managing the federal government's use of the spectrum. Federal government means incumbent user, Department of Defense, Federal Aviation Administration, National Weather Service. So if you're interested in landing planes safely, defending the country, catching criminals, FBI, DOJ, defending the border, protecting the border, DHS, predicting the weather, National Weather Service, that's what the folks that we regulate do.
Netflix?
Netflix?
Yeah.
No, not Netflix. Those agencies have long been using spectrum like to produce as inputs to producing public goods, right? I'm sorry, I learned econobabble from George and Julia. George taught me the term rent-seeking when we were playing National Association of Broadcasters in softball. And we had a cheer about the rent-seekers that we were playing, right? Remember that?
I don't know, I was drunk.
Okay. And Julia has taught me how to value public goods, which she said, it's really hard, right? But doable, right? So how to wrestle spectrum away from those agencies has been a monumental task that has been done through a series of legislation. Started in 1993, 97, more recently in 2012, again in 2015, and again in 2018. You see the trend there, right? More recent, the legislation has either produced, told the federal government, take a look at what you're using and see if it can be repurposed. And it also has provided incentives or funds to study bands, like through the Spectrum Relocation Fund, or to use those funds from the Spectrum Relocation Fund to reimburse those agencies for the costs that they incur when they have to relocate. And the most recent example, successful example of that is the Advanced Wireless Systems in 1755, 1780, and 1695, 1710 megahertz, which was part of the AWS-3 auction, the largest and most successful auction ever that has occurred, and that has it is fully reimbursing the agencies for all their costs that are being incurred. And after that, the Pipeline Act of 2015 created even more funds available, actually just $500 million, for agencies to study other bands, and it inspired at least the FAA to look at the bands that it's using long-range radars in, 1300 to 1350 megahertz, to figure out a way it can relocate out of that band into another band, and use more state-of-the-art radar technology, so that they can implement their next gen air traffic control system, and as a result land planes safely and increase the traffic for air traffic. So have more flights, which and those kinds of advantages. So it all kind of trickles down. The other things that we're doing, there's this memo that just came out by the president, which we have right here in my hands. It says it's all about developing a sustainable spectrum strategy for America's future. So the big ticket item here is by next summer, the Department of Commerce through NTIA is going to be trying to come up with a strategy, a long-term strategy for managing spectrum, a national strategy. So that would apply across the board, not just federal spectrum use, which is one of these artificial lines that was developed decades and decades ago, but how the FCC manages spectrum, so that the issues that Morgan is dealing with don't have to take so long to deal with. I remember
I'm in favor of that.
The
I haven't got
broadband-
that much longer.
the broadband plan. I remember 2012, I was still in the private sector at the time. I looked at the broadband plan. There was a sentence that said, spectrum repurposing takes a long time, right, period. So then the next sentence, which I would have written, but John Leibowitz wrote something else, I would have said, well, we need to change the way spectrum is repurposed so it doesn't take as long. No, the sentence that was written says, so we better get started now. That's what it says. So it takes a long time. We have to figure out how we can compress it and do things like, I think what was Morgan doing is what I thought about doing years ago when I was at the FCC, when we developed in secondary markets for spectrum licenses. Separate out the licensing from the infrastructure. Is there a way to have a separately owned license scheme that then somebody else is operating the systems on the ground? So there's a partnership there, but it's not necessarily dependent on the regulator as much as it is, and that's why, because we created the flexibility, the FCC created the flexibility, why the transition from 2G to 3G to 4G, and now 5G, typically didn't require a lot of regulatory involvement because of the flexibility that was granted those licensees, those 2G licensees from the start to transition and repurpose their spectrum without pretty much any government involvement whatsoever.
That's a good segue. I think that is the issue. We have uses that are going to generate enormous value. We have incumbent uses that generate none or very little value. And every day we wait is benefit lost. I mean, there's no plenty in delay, And so I want to ask Julia, who's been involved in this, what are the roadblocks? I mean, what do you see as being the things that most slow this process down?
So I think it's it's a good question. I would say, so certainly in many ways the incumbents, right? So this is far more true when I was at NTIA, but incumbents, federal users, they have to be accommodated. Just about everybody has a use, even if it has a low value, and very few of them can simply turn off their systems. So even if it is, there is an alternative service which may not be wireless technology, may not be relying on spectrum, every incumbent is reluctant to make that change. They don't want to make the change, whether it's federal or commercial service, without pretty strong guarantee that it's going to work. And so I think working out that interference in many cases takes an incredibly long time. But I'm realistic about the fact that, in fact, there is the rulemaking process to get an auction run is a long process. There's a whole lot of pieces that need to go into an auction, and to the extent we can make some of this happen, we can repurpose some spectrum through the secondary market, I think all the better. I mean, frankly, the FCC has a sort of marching orders of spectrum auctions to be running in the near future, and to the extent there are opportunities which can just be, sort of more easily done through secondary markets, I think that is a wonderful avenue that we should explore more often, frankly. But on the other hand, the biggest question there is coordination, right? So the reason to get FCC or NTIA involved is coordination on, when you have multiple users in a band, multiple incumbents, getting them to work together and not create some holdup problem or have one or two create a holdup problem is incredibly challenging. And that's where really having the federal government come in through either agency is helpful. But yeah, if whatever can be done on the secondary markets and done more expediently that way, I think would be great.
I can sense that the incumbent problem is rich with Mr. O'Brien over here. Who's in that band, and what do you need to turn that $300 million into a network?
But let's stop and say, in our case, we're by far the largest incumbent in the space, and we only have that position because the FCC auctioned the spectrum off, and we or our predecessors were the highest bidder. So that's, to me, I call that's the system working. So having invested in this spectrum, we're now motivated to try to invest more to make the spectrum work more, and all that's working. The idiosyncrasy of this spectrum is that half of it was auctioned and half of it wasn't. And the half of it that wasn't is not commercial operations like ours aren't eligible for it, and so it gets into the whole private radio, and I know everybody doesn't want me to go down that path. But let me just answer your question by saying the largest users of the spectrum, other than us, are utilities. And that has actually led, perversely, to kind of a positive sense in which we, starting long before we filed at the FCC, approached the utilities and other users. The railroads are users, and the oil and gas industry are users. And we've been working with them, working with the trade associations and working with the incumbents. And so in the process of this 4 years, which in some ways seems like a lot of time, but these are complex proceedings. It sometimes took us a year to get a meeting. These are, I have had incumbents, representatives say, this is really important, we should get together on this. How does your calendar look for March and April? And I'm sitting there saying, March or April? What is wrong with you people? But then again, the more I learn about these incumbents, their uses of spectrum, the way they make decisions, the fact that their industry, specifically electric utilities and the investor-owned utilities, is in crisis because of change. All of these things make you a little more sympathetic. So the due process, there it is. At least the decision-making is on the record, and so it builds the getting to the is it interference? Will there be unacceptable and harmful interference or not? Which is the better use case? How do you introduce the new technology? Whatever. All those things begin to settle out. So the last thing I would want to be is a proponent of 4 years. On the other hand, there are things that need to happen so that large, as I'm frequently reminded by the utilities, large systems that are in place and need to be in place and working flawlessly when bad things happen, bad weather or bad other incidents, that's not disrupted. So we have to become, as the proponent of change, we carry the burden of making sure that this change, net, is in the public interest. The one thing I will say is that in the old days, there were more elements of the public interest than tend to be today. The marketplace tends to have an awful lot of sway, and probably properly so. But there are other issues. There are other issues in spectrum management besides the marketplace in terms of what's in the public interest. And so this is why I say it's of course it's frustrating. Of course it's annoying. I have meetings with investors who can't believe that it could take this long, and that's the challenge, because I think risk capital, the kind of capital that funds us and others, that risk capital will take risk, but they're impatient. And what I've been trying to say to the FCC staffers is that you want that kind of capital available. That capital will drive change, will take risks, will invest in new technologies. But it has to see that the system is responsive to this. I think with Chairman Pai, our process has moved more rapidly, more sanely, and I think we're in a good path. But it does take time.
It's interesting, the conflict between what the market needs in terms of the risk capital versus spectrum repurposing takes a long time. You know, I mean, you're just completely out of sync a little bit, and there's got to be some way to. And I think, I mean, you look at 200 to 250 megahertz of spectrum, and you get focused on that. I think this is a really great thing. I think that what's interesting about the PDV case is everything is in that case. All the pieces of the puzzle, all the things you need to look at. You've got many incumbents, very different incentive structures, utilities whose ideas about market transactions are entirely different than the normal way we think about market transactions. You've got universities, airlines that probably don't even know where the license paperwork is. Maybe, I mean, it's all kinds of crazy problems. You solved had an interference problem that could rejigger the band to solve that. So all the interesting pieces. The most interesting case I've ever worked in telecommunications is payphone dial-around compensation, which sounds like an utter bore, but it had all these very interesting elements. They're sort of fundamental to regulation. The FCC was asked to regulate one price of a homogeneous product and couldn't do it. At the same time, they were doing the trifecta on special access reform and doing all this stuff. And I'm looking at this, you can't do this, right? What is all that? Hey, I'm going to come to you. What is it that the company, how does the company want this spectrum to be delivered to them? Do they want auctions? Would it prefer a different mechanism if it could be done quicker? Are they interested in non-exclusive licenses, or do they want to buy the exclusive licenses in big blocks? Are they interested in some of these sharing ideas that have been thrown around?
So you're going to ask me what the company wants, and I hesitate to try to answer
What
that question, but I will try. And I'll start by saying, when I thought about this panel, talking about how do you bring spectrum to higher value uses, thought about Ronald Coase, I was thinking about Tom Hazlitt's book, but listening to Morgan, I really come away with, it's really Tolstoy. And my conclusion is all unhappy / underutilized spectrum is unhappy and underutilized in its own way. But there are some common themes, and I think they'll help answer your question.
But the FCC could make me happy. All happy families are the same.
I think there's a broad agreement that sort of your baseline for how you do this is you have flexible use licenses that are transferable and renewable, and you create a situation where the entity that has the rights internalizes the opportunity cost of, that putting the spectrum to a lower value use. It doesn't solve everything though, because it doesn't solve problems like Peter talked about where the spectrum is used in the production of a public good. The valuation of that spectrum, difficult, but I hear doable, and I'm glad to hear that. Morgan's situation, you've got, you have this complex situation of legacy users, holdouts, people who, these utilities, they're not necessarily subject to the same market incentives as other licensees might be subject to. So very complicated. Now I'll get to your question. What does the company want? We want
a better question
we,
than I asked.
we want those flexible, transferable, renewable rights. And are they always going to be the same? No, I think not necessarily. I think we recognize that situations like Peter talked about with AWS3, where we were able to get the win-win clear, although we are still in the process of clearing the uplink spectrum, but clear that for basically exclusive use. They may not be all situations in the future, but whatever the rights are, the rights that we get, that they are flexible, transferable, and renewable, I think that's what we're looking for. And does it have to be an auction? Not necessarily, but auctions do seem to be a good way of doing it. Certainly secondary market transactions, which is kind of a version of what's going on with the C-band, that's another alternative. I think there have also been discussions about FCC commissioners have proposed an incentive auction in the EBS spectrum. I think there's opportunities for those kinds of transactions. So figure out, I think you have to look at each individual case, decide what rights can be made available, what's the best mechanism for doing it, but when you do it, the rights have those characteristics that I described.
I want to come back to something that you made me think about. There's sort of a couple of ways. One way you talked about how to deal with the financial issues with government spectrum. Other people have proposed, kind of treating the government like a market participant and paying them off, and then they'll cough up their spectrum. Is that viable, or is really the question with the government users, if you can move them to a better place with better technology, that's really what moves them versus saying, hey, I'll cut you a check if you'll give me 10 megahertz of spectrum?
Well, I'll throw in another, speak a little more econo-babble as principal agent problem, right? Which I remember Evan raised it in his paper in 2002 timeframe, in the Big Bang, Evan Correll mentioned that's going to be a difficulty if you try to do, Big Bang auction where you overlay everything, you just try to sell it all at once. You're going to have resistance from the folks who are going to be losing their jobs. Those are the agents, right? If you can find, you probably have the same thing, Morgan, right? If you don't go to the utility spectrum managers to talk about putting them out of work, you got to go to the people who, have to pay the bills and look at the bottom line for the company.
And those people are terrified that I might say megahertz or kilohertz to them, because they have absolutely no idea what I'm talking about.
And then they go to their agents who understand this or purport to understand this and explain it to them and say, you cannot sell or transfer these licenses to these guys because they'll put technology in that won't work for us, or it'll be some other kind of argument, right? And because I have to believe them, they're the experts, right? Oh yes, by the way, they're also trying to protect their job, right? Because that's what it's important to them. And I think they're very smart people. They've been working on this for a long time, and they may know what's right, but at the same time, you need to go to the right level and say, okay, at what point at the right level does the incentive work? Does it works at the general maybe who says I can make a trade-off between buying this new fancy communication system and using 30 megahertz of spectrum, or I can somehow get money out of that spectrum and then buy some tanks with it. Those discussions don't happen, right? Those trade-offs aren't made, especially during the long span of time it takes to do these kinds of transitions. So ultimately, if you involve the right group of people at the right levels, and you see the folks that are, and this is what happened at AMS3, when I think the turning point there was when the core decision maker, in that case it was the CIO for the Department of Defense, and there were some other agencies that have already bought in and said, okay, here's a path forward, we can do this, and we could preserve these certain systems in place, we could preserve this system in this place, and then all the other systems we can move out, and we know we're going to be compensated 100% for our costs.
I think there's one other component which is related to this problem, and I think it's kind of an undercurrent of all of this, which is incumbents' capacity and ability to invest and see whatever the technology is that makes the repurposing possible. And particularly on the federal side, you see it in terms of, they may know there's some pie-in-the-sky solution, and in fact, that solution might get them a better system and a better service, but that funding gap is extraordinary. And I think, there is the, no matter what it is, in the C-band, I mean, the reality is the satellite guys are going to have to figure out how to squeeze more into less, and that may require some additional infrastructure. And so coming up with, when you're losing spectrum and have to make investments at the same time, thinking that there's going to be funding in that trade-off that will cover it and still get you sort of a benefit is hard.
The question I always say to the incumbent, the incumbent needs to be asking, what's in it for me, right? And a lot of the times the only answer we can give is, oh, you'll be protected from interference. What does that get me, right? I got to share the spectrum and be protected from interference. Where's the benefit in that? That means I increase my monitoring or enforcement costs, right? That doesn't get me anything except for higher risk. And in the government, in public safety or safety of life type services, like the FAA provides, they ain't gonna take any risk whatsoever. If is all you're giving me is assurance I'm protected from interference, I'm sorry, that's nothing incentive there.
Where are we on time?
We can actually take a couple questions from the audience. We
Yeah,
got about
okay,
5
I'll
minutes.
ask one more question and then we'll do that. You've been doing this 4 years, right?
18.
If there's one thing you could have, get the FCC to do, it's NPRM or in sport or whatever, what do you think would be the thing that would speed this up the most?
I think it's something that the FCC has already talked about, which is put a shot clock on something like this. Once the proposal is made, if it meets the FCC's test of it's reasonable enough to put it out, then say, and we're going to conclude this within 1 year. So everybody's on notice, get your arguments, get together, get in a room, whatever else, we, the FCC, will decide this in a year.
What happens when it's concluded to the incumbents? Say it ends, the shot clock ends, the transactions window, as we call it, ends in a year, and some incumbent says, I'm just going to sit here and ignore it. What happens to them at the end of it?
I mean, obviously you have the FCC. Once the rules change, I've had a lot of rebanding experience because we rebanded 800 megahertz for public safety, and that was a far more complicated process. But at the end of the day, if the FCC is standing in reserve to enforce the rule, it works. The very same people who were obstacles before that wouldn't answer your phone calls immediately change their attitude and say, okay, the sooner this is done, the better. I don't want operational inconvenience, so let's get this thing done. So it's just regulatory certainty. And of course, I'm completely in support of the concept that the proponent of change bears the risk and has to incorporate that into his business plan of assuring comparable facilities to the incumbent. So then the FCC can make that decision without handing somebody a total loss. And we all know that the political process just doesn't like to hand anybody a complete loss. That's not the way it works.
Questions from the audience? You all right here? Right here? Bud?
We know who you are.
I know, I think I play a band.
TRDO, this is for Hank. You mentioned the 200 megahertz they say they can clear up the C-band, that includes a 20 megahertz guard band. Commissioner O'Reilly and T-Mobile have said, well, more than that would be good, but you guys pointed out in your comments, you're in a situation where you're also a provider of multi-channel programming, so you rely on the C-band part of your company. Is that why you all haven't said, well, 200 is not enough, we should get 300, we should get, because you're kind of in between there, you would like to use that spectrum for wireless, but you also need that spectrum for what it delivers for programming for your customers.
So my answer to that is I would say how much ultimately can be repurposed in a way that provides continuity to the current services and the users of those services, so AT&T is a customer of those services, can really only be discovered through the kind of process that is set out in the notice. And if it turns out that you can repurpose 300 or more even and still have continuity of service, equivalent capacity for the existing services that would give the, avoid too much disruption to the existing users and their customers, I certainly have no objection to that. I just don't think we have enough information at this time to know exactly what can be done here. This information is dispersed among the service providers and the users of the service. So it really is mostly a technical and cost question, but I have no objection to if the outcome is that more can be repurposed.
Other questions? Really? What's one there, Larry?
This is for Peter. The federal government can't benefit, so to speak, from, let's say, funds for repurposing, let's say, like in auctions, like the DOD, et cetera, can't get the money itself. It goes back to the Treasury, as I understand it. Are there mechanisms where the DOD or other agency could benefit? And also some of these technologies may provide additional functionality as you go up, as you go up the technology bands, et cetera. Can they take advantage of having more functionality than what they have in their embedded systems?
Did we hear that? So, that depends what you mean by benefit. I mean, the Spectrum Relocation Fund is to provide research and development of money so that they could explore, an agency could explore like FAA is doing, NOAA, National Weather Service is doing right now in a study, and we're thinking that the DoD will maybe come in with a couple more proposals. But that money provides them the ability to at least look at the problem where, to start studying the thing when they weren't subject to any kind of reimbursement. The benefit of better technology has also been talked about and considered, especially where, like for example, like 5G, right? The 5G, fifth generation technology, promises more secure, robust, networking, and obviously the Department of Defense and other agencies would benefit from that kind of security. In fact, the President in his memorandum specifically called out 5G as a technology that could be advantageous to federal agencies. Well, yes, federal agencies use spectrum for communications, like fifth generation type, communications, but they also use it for non-communications, radar systems, right? But we do see agencies taking advantage of new technologies. Even like the Justice Department, when they were moved out of the AWS-3 band, they started picking up more and more commercials, doing more and more commercial type services and technologies for like surveillance and things like that. But that's at a cost. If there's a middle ground where they don't have to be subscribers to a service and they don't have to self-provision, but there's a middle ground somewhere, Like, I think Morgan's model is kind of like that, right? Where the company, utility, can bring the infrastructure and the operations to the game, but the license is owned by someone else at another level and managed in what is like a long-term lease, maybe. And that's the other option, so leasing, right? So and NTIA put this as a proposal in its budget for 2019, which was a legislative proposal that would authorize the leasing of federal spectrum, so say like the private sector. So under that approach, one way of making that work could be a federal agency that has a lot of spectrum, or usually there's not just one federal agency that uses spectrum in a band. It's usually multiple federal agencies. So can those federal agencies get together and agree that, yeah, we'll lease spectrum to these private entities, and maybe these private entities can then lease back, or provide service back, to the federal agency in a way that makes sense. And I know that worked kind of in the utility side with 800, right? When like Con Ed sold its 800 megahertz licenses to Nextel, Nextel then turned around and sold and provided service to Con Ed. Is that accurate?
Precisely right.
Yeah. So that kind of new thinking, is going on. The concepts of incentives and ways, and there's also some legislation that's been pending for a while, introduced by Congresswoman Matsui, to give an option to agencies instead of just the plain old cost reimbursement, 10% of the auction proceeds. Was it 10%? I think that was it. That, of course, the spectrum managers we deal with all said, nah, that's not good, because that's a risk, right? Then they're taking a risk of not getting reimbursed and having to satisfy, get only 10% of the proceeds, and then all the proceeds could be used to offset something else. So there wasn't really a lot of incentive there, but I think they're working on enhancing that.
I think Phoenix Center actually has a paper, I can't remember, spectrum management or whatever, that addresses some of these issues with the government. You can't think of the government like you do a market participant. You just have to throw that thinking out. You have to do that a lot, about a lot of different people. It's not always these buyers and sellers meeting in some centralized place looking for an angle to make a profit. They just don't all think that way. And the government doesn't think that way. And I don't know if I'd want them. I don't know if I'd want some appointee who takes a job for 2 years to sell all the spectrum so he can sweep up his office, with a cone of silence or whatever the hell they want to put in there. So there's a very different motivations. There's different motivations than Morgan has to face with utilities. These guys are guaranteed profits by a regulator. I mean, they don't have the same view of opportunity cost that everybody else has. Universities are the same way. The president of the University of Phoenix makes $11 million. The president of Harvard makes $800,000. That's a pretty screwed up system. I don't know if I can trust these people to make good decisions, market decisions at least. But anyway, this was a great panel. I hope you all enjoyed it. These are great people. They may stick around for more conversation if you want to have it. Thanks for listening, and thank you for your questions. Thank you, guys.